The BBC Nigel Farage Question Time episode was kicked off by a random audience member who just happened to be a BBC freelance producer. The fact that a BBC producer was not only randomly chosen to ask a question, but randomly chosen to ask the very first question is apparently a coincidence.
So let's start with our first question tonight, which is from Mark Corden.
Hello. I'd like to know, what is it about you and your party that attracts racists and extremists, whether you say you want them or not?
Well, I've done more to drive the far right out of British politics than anybody else alive.
It's already a stretch that a BBC producer, even a freelance one and so distanced from the corporation to a degree, ends up asking a question at all in the supposedly impartial BBC audience. It is a bit of a stretch too far that he's the first one who gets chosen to ask his question. The first question is the one that gets the most viewership, because as time goes by, people start to tune out. The most people get to see the first one, and it just happened to be a BBC producer who got to ask that first question. But Mark Corden, in spite of being randomly chosen and therefore due no credit whatsoever, was as chipper and smug on his social media afterwards as he was in asking that question. You have to agree that he looks incredibly chuffed with himself, and this was reflected in his Facebook commentary afterwards. Not only did I get to glare at Nigel Farage, but I was called on to ask the first question, and have since made the BBC and ITV news reports too. I was also interviewed afterwards for BBC Breakfast, so if anyone's up early tomorrow, you may see me again. Must be my turn for 15 minutes of fame. I cannot find the BBC Breakfast interview anywhere. Fridays and Sundays are there, but there is no sign of Saturdays. Did the BBC delete it? He also included in that comment a link to a BBC News report which included his contribution.
He's attempting a fight back as his party is hit with yet more accusations of racism.
What is it about you and your party that attracts racists and extremists, whether you say you want them or not?
So he's not exactly hiding his light under a bushel. He's very pleased with himself indeed. But Farage picked up on it. The BBC invited on a man who has directed several BBC films to ambush me with the first question last night. Now we find him on Facebook boasting about it. The BBC licence fee must be scrapped. When Mr. Corden was being as joyful as a giggling girl on his Facebook, he did not foresee his comments being used as ammunition for the scrapping of the licence fee of the organisation he works for, and therefore potentially damaging his own income. So, too late, he deleted that joyous comment and replaced it with this one. I don't really do Twitter, but apparently my question to Nigel Farage last night has quite riled him. For the record, to anyone who doesn't know, I am a freelance in drama, working as an assistant director for many and varied TV and film production companies over my career, including the BBC on several occasions. I do not and have not worked for the News and Current Affairs division. I applied to be part of the Question Time audience. They did not approach me, nor did they provide the question, nor did they, and here I have to switch to a copy taken earlier for reasons which will become clear, nor did they pay me in any way. My opinions are entirely my own. I am not a member of any political party and attended the recording as a currently undecided voter in the upcoming general election. People who work in the entertainment industry are ordinary members of the public and are allowed to ask questions of prospective parliamentary candidates, however inconvenient to them. They are, Mark, but BBC producers being represented as random members of the public and being invited to ask not only questions, but the first question, in turn raises questions. And it appears to have raised some additional questions in his own head, because where there was that, there is now that, i.e. absolutely nothing whatsoever. His entirely less braggadocious comment suffered the same fate as the first one. He zapped it. His confidence does seem to be ebbing away at this point. And he didn't stop there, but while we have the opportunity, let's examine that CD which Farage mentioned in making his point that he's basically a BBC plant. It reads like a BBC Who's Who. You've got Doctor Who, Casualty, Man Like Mobeen, Hetty Feather, Holby City and BBC Doctors. It remains a coincidence that this BBC producer, whose CV brims with BBC work, was asked to ask the first question. And I said let's examine it while we can, because that too has now all been deleted. Where there was that, there is now that. Everything is gone and we've time travelled back to 2020. And where there was all that BBC stuff, there is now... So this swaggering little man, with his apparently devastating gotcha question repeated on BBC News, has ended up deleting his entire social media content after being outed as a BBC stooge. A BBC producer randomly chosen to ask the first question on a key BBC show. And his swaggering little Facebook foray resulted in him deleting all his Facebook content and giving Farage the opportunity to advocate again for the end of the BBC licence fee, which could easily have a detrimental effect on Mark Corden's own income, being a BBC producer. So job well done.
Hello. I'd like to know, what is it about you and your party that attracts racists and extremists, whether you say you want them or not?